because these are not typed exceptions. So basically, you are making the life of the person who calls your function a lot more difficult if you throw something that is not an exception. So if you can, always do this, right? Always throw an exception if you are too lazy to create your own exception class. If the error is too small, say something in the exception. If the budget is a problem, say something. If the city is a problem, say so. And then the main function simply prints out the actual error message. It doesn't have to anticipate all of those crap. Right? So exception is a base class of all exceptions, but you can create your own exception like this. It is just simply extend the exception class. There's nothing special here. You put, inherited public exception, and then the important thing here is the what. Yeah. So if you want your exception to be able to return some kind of error, then you probably have to implement this. Because it is a class, it is a normal class, you can have other things as well, not just the message. You can have the code. Let's say you write an exception that deals with HTTP errors, then you know that you need to include the code for page not found, 500 for server errors or something like that. So you can include everything here, and you can customize your message any way you want. Because it is just a class, really nothing special. Right? So the previous fix, right, for the problem of not knowing what to return when the index is out of bound is to throw the index back. Right? But that is bad because you can't catch it. Now this is a much better implementation. Instead of throwing an int, you will create a sort of array index exception, which will have a very customized message. It will say index, if the index is not 0, it will say something appropriate. If the index is too big, it will say something appropriate. And then here you just throw it, and you don't have to worry about creating messages yourself. And also in here, the main function simply prints out a message instead of having to check if the error was because the index is less than 0 or because the index is more than the length. Right, so different messages for different kind of errors, and everything is handled by the exception class. Again, separation of concern. Sometimes it makes your program a little bit longer. Right? So when you if you implement your own class or exception, then in general you will add about 7 lines to your program. For a small program like this, it can look a little bit much longer than it was. But for a big program, then the difference is basically nothing, and you get the benefit of having a much better flow of your program. So yeah, like this. Instead of having the main function to come up with the message, you leave that to the exception class or to the function that creates the exception. Now this is what happens when you don't catch exception even in the main function. If you don't catch it in the main function, then your program will be terminated. Now, if you throw an exception, runtime error is a derived class of exception. If you do through an exception, then the operating system sort of knows what to do and prints out the error, and you know what's wrong. If you don't, if you just throw a string, even though you have the same content, right? This string contains the exact same information as this object, but because it is not an exception, the operating system doesn't know what to do, and it simply prints out the type, which is not very meaningful. Right, so this is another reason why you always want to throw an exception instead of something that is not. Right. Okay. So when an exception occurs, you really can't do nothing. If you don't do anything, then the main function will, then the operating system will do something for you. So you cannot really ignore an exception. However, there's another very commonly used method to deal with exception. That is, you catch an exception and then you throw something else, right? Something that is of your concern. Okay, let's say you have a class that connects to a server. Put in a instance of server, right? Then you try to connect to server dot to connect, for example, and you anticipate that if something is wrong, then you will get the error here. And usually you will have something more specific than exception, probably HTTP exception or something like that. So sometimes you catch an exception, you don't want to deal with the exception right here, right? Because this can be part of the library and you don't know what the main function wants to do. So some people can decide to reconnect, right? Some people can decide to just terminate the program. So you want to leave the decision to the people who would call this function. So if you terminate your program here, say exit, right? Then anyone who calls this function will have to, will have no way to reconnect if it fails. So you don't want to do this. You want to simply lock the error, and then somehow notify the main function. And you usually do that by throwing something else, right? Something else, server exception. So this is through browser exception, for example. Now, why would you want to do this? Why would you catch an exception and then do something else, right? Why don't you just not do this and just let the exception to be propagated back to the main function? Because sometimes the exception here is too specific, and let's say this is a browser, and you anticipate that most of your users are idiots and they don't really have any idea what the hell is HTTP exception, what the hell is 404, what the hell is 500. So those information is really not important, and you don't want to give them something that is too technical. Right? You would do something saying, the internet might be have a problem, please try again, something like that. So basically this is more like dumbing down the specificity of the error. So this happens a lot, and don't be surprised if you see this in some code base. 10 minutes. Okay, so do you have any question? No? Anyone still don't know why we need to use exception? Why should we concern ourselves with these concepts? So complicated. So again, I probably will write down some benefits of exception. First is, don't have to the first one is don't have to sacrifice the return statement. With no exception, you are forced to return an error. With exception, you can always return the exact object that you create, and the error is handled in a separate way. Now, this is the first. The second is once. Even if you call A calls B, calls C, calls D, the error will always be dealt with only once. Next one is separation of concern. Next one is helpful message. Even if program is terminated. Yeah, I can think of these. Another thing to remember is the order, right, in which they should be should be caught. More specific than less specific than no specific at all. You can create your own exception, and it would just be a normal child class of the exception class. You can catch an exception and reduce its specificity by throwing another exception. Or you might want to include more information. So the server doesn't know about, let's say, your IP address. Oh, no, it does. The server, when it returns an HTTP exception, it can only return you the code or maybe your IP address. But the browser knows more about you. Maybe it's because of your account, or it's because of your operating system, which the server doesn't know about. So you catch an exception and then you include all of those information down. So yeah, not necessarily dumbing down the exception. Sometimes you want to include more, which is not available for the original creator of this exception. That's it. So from next week, Ilana will resume teaching you. Okay. If you still haven't collected your exam script, then it's here. I'm not